Former UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill once wrote, "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." One can point to countless examples of this wisdom coming to pass in reality, even in the most unexpected places. Much like how the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game was ruled by big numbers in its inception, Duel Links faced a very similar situation. And, much like how everything changed when powerful effect monsters were released in the post-Legend of Blue Eyes world, Duel Links witnessed a swing towards brains over brawn in the release of its next two boxes, Flame of the Tyrant and Valkyrie's Rage. Welcome back to the history of Duel Links, the series where we take a trip back in time throughout the Duel Links timeline, stopping along the way to look at the major releases, updates, and events that impacted the game's past, present, and future. I'm Diatonic, and it's time once again to jump back into the far-forgotten year of 2017, where we finally begin to get our first taste of competitive play in Duel Links. But before that, as always, I appreciate your unrivaled support for this series. I do this for all of you, and for the posterity of the game, so it's great to see so many enjoying the history of Duel Links so far. We've still got a long way to go, so if you want to be there for every twist and turn, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts about the series with a like and even a comment. I try to read and respond to all of them. Lastly, if you're really enjoying this series and want to contribute even further, consider shopping TCG Player for your next TCG purchase with my affiliate link, which is in the description. Alright, no more delays. You've waited long enough to continue, so let's get going. We've got a lot to talk about, starting with the game's second mini-box. The second mini-box, Flame of the Tyrant, became available to all duelists on February 3rd, 2017. This was the first truly new release for everyone, as the first three boxes had already seen individual releases in Japan prior to the game's global release. Of course, players were looking for something interesting for the first worldwide concurrent release, but that wasn't exactly how it would be received. Flame of the Tyrant heavily focused on fire-type monsters, and marked the true beginning of the end for the beatdown meta. It featured very few normal monsters, 5 to be exact, and most players began to see the writing on the wall with the inclusion of more than 20 effect monsters. This box was incredibly unconcerned with spells and traps, so players looking to improve their back row were mostly out of luck. The box was panned upon release, and suffered even more since it was mostly being compared to the incredibly powerful Neo Impact and the cohesive, easy-to-build strategies found in Age of Discovery. A disappointment to be sure. However, this wouldn't remain the case for long, as players would find some interesting interactions and strategies buried within its super rares and rares. But let's begin with the big bad of the set, Tyrant Dragon. Clocking in at an attack just shy of Blue Eyes with 2900 for the same price, its multi-attack effect was where it shined. It was fairly unique in that regard for the time, and combined with the ability to stop traps from targeting it, it was an okay cover card. Though Beatdown was on the way out, this card could end up being a decent threat, if and only if you summoned it early. The biggest problem, aside from difficulty summoning it, was that it didn't actually avoid the major traps and flip effects of the time. If your opponent flipped Mirror Wall, there wasn't a thing Tyrant Dragon could do about it. My favorite combo with Tyrant Dragon was Shooting Star Bow Seal and Kaiba's Beatdown skill. It actually let you take 2 direct attacks as long as your opponent had a monster, and was more than enough to pick up an OTK win. Next up, Sergeant Electro was an excellent way to stop face downs in the back row from activating. 1600 attack was decent at the time, and would actually end up serving as a cornerstone for one of the many top tier decks during this period. Until your opponent found a way to deal with this card, things like Mirror Wall and Enemy Controller, both heavily played during that period, could be locked down. He was essentially the bar-none best way to lock your opponents out of their defensive plays, and was fairly scary as part of a cohesive strategy. The Agent of Creation Venus was released in Flame of the Tyrant, but it unfortunately didn't accomplish much until the release of Valkyrie's Rage, the next box. It had a ton of future potential, and would become the driving force behind the deck known as Venus Shineball. For the most part, it was basically there to grab tribute fodder from your deck, but would find much more versatile uses in the near future. Being a fairy was a key part of this card's success, but just keep it in the back of your mind. We'll come back to this card. While we're on the topic, I think Mystical Shineball itself is important enough to mention here. It's an incredibly unassuming card that harkens back to the earliest days of the game, with an unimpressive stat line and no effects to bolster its playability. But being a normal monster that could be summoned from the deck wasn't all bad. It was essentially the best friend of cards like White Elephant's Gift, giving you access to card draw for just 500 life points. It could also be used with cards like Order to Charge, which more than made up for its abysmal stats and lack of effect. I personally recall some buzz around the Shallow Grave prior to its release. It was the closest thing we had to a Monster Reborn-like effect, and that let us overlook the fact that it gave your opponent a free monster too. It could be used to get back a big monster that you may have tragically lost, but I always felt it was better served in decks that relied on flip effect monsters. I recall using it alongside the earliest mill strategies with things like Hero's Shadow Scout. He'd force your opponent to draw and/or mill when he flipped, then Shallow Grave could get him back almost immediately. But since Hero didn't release until Valkyrie's Rage, you could use it for something like Hain until then. The Golden Apples was a trap that made it even more risky to swing all out with your biggest monsters. If you took damage with no monsters under your control, you could gain back all the life points you lost and summon a token with a stat line equal to the life you lost. It was sort of like the modern day staple Battle and Boxer Veil at first glance, though it pales in comparison to Veil, which activates from hand instead of needing to be set on the field for a turn. While the card was weak to Electro, it was just another way that the back row helped contribute to the death of Beatdown. 4-starred Ladybug was certainly an irritant to competitive duelists, but I believe it was merely the primer for the arrival of Possessed Dark Soul, a card which could steal all of your opponent's level 3 and lower monsters. Why exactly was taking control of level 3s such a good effect? Well, because there were a surprising amount of popular targets he could steal. Agent of Creation Venus, Jerry Beans Man, even the all-powerful Relinquished. He was a nasty card that saw a massive rise to power during the final day of the first KC Cup, which we'll be covering later in this episode. I previously mentioned early mill strategies involving cards like Hero's Shadow Scout, but the king of early milling would have to be Warm Worm. Not only was he basically a landmine for your opponents to run into, but his effect activated from other popular cards like Order to Charge. He was somewhat hated for a long time, as he just turned into an absolute nuisance to deal with. Unfortunately, way too many decks have graveyard shenanigans for milling 3 to be all that devastating nowadays. But back then, yeah, it definitely hurt to lose a few cards. Finally, Legion the Fiend Jester was a card that would see some prominence in later decks, such as Gravekeepers and the Dark Magician version of the dreaded 3-star demotion. It was able to search for spellcaster normal monsters when it went from the field to the grave, so it helped dig for your Dark Magicians before activating 3-star demotion and playing them for free. It also let you tribute summon a spellcaster in addition to your normal summon, but I think the card was better known for the ability to set your hand up for 3-star demotion. So, where exactly does Flame of the Tyrant stand in terms of rating? Well, I think one of its biggest points was both a positive and a negative. It helped pave the way for a number of future decks. It's great because it was what we needed to help create the versatile metagame that we saw through portions of 2017. But that's not exactly what you want to see when the game is still new. It required a slew of other cards that either weren't released yet, or were locked behind level ups or entirely other boxes. When you compare it to the incredibly coherent Age of Discovery, it's hard to blame people for finding this one underwhelming. For the time, this was definitely somewhere around a C-. Sure, when you take into account things that would release and be discovered later, the perception of Flame of the Tyrant improved, but by itself, I'd say C- is fair. In the modern era, this box is absolutely devoid of any and all substance, save maybe for Agent of Creation Venus. If you're looking to build something to take into ladder, avoid it at all costs. For a modern rating, I'd put this thing right down with Age of Discovery at around a D. Thankfully, it really wouldn't take long for additional support to come, making Flame of the Tyrant a bit more bearable. In fact, players would only need to wait a few short weeks for the next batch of new cards to come to the game. But back-to-back releases like that wouldn't come without problems. Released only a few weeks later, on February 27, 2017, Valkyrie's Rage was the third in a long line of main boxes soon to come, and such a quick, sudden release would end up having some unintended consequences. It gave a bevy of new options for top-tier and casual decks alike, which made a splash in the community. Decks that weren't quite complete and in desperate need of new support were granted their wish, and those looking to build something new had their pick of several different playables. So what exactly was the problem with this box? More cards means more strategy and variety, right? Well, yes, but many felt as though the game's gem economy hadn't been taken into consideration. Not only were things like character level up gems more scarce in the days of DM World, as there just weren't that many characters available yet, but there was almost no time in between releases for players to build up more gems. This was far from the biggest problem with the box's release, but let's save that for a bit and talk about some of the cards featured in this set. First up, the previously mentioned Agent of Creation Venus saw some relatively decent support in Sky Scourge Inrise. It had a super strong effect that allowed it to banish monsters without triggering their effects, but the drawback was trying to summon it was fairly strict. By combining Venus's ability to summon Shineballs with cards like Order to Charge and White Elephant's Gift to fill up your graveyard, Inrise became much easier to play. Even cards like Magical Merchant from Neo Impact would make this process easier, and bypass one of the biggest downsides to the card. Unfortunately, Inrise's effect stopped it from attacking, but in the earlier days of the game, I'd say this was well worth the ability to avoid attacking into things. The Fiend Mega Cyber was a fairly decent beat stick that you could summon against almost any deck. It was a way to punish players that were overextending beyond what they could handle, or a way to try and recover after getting wiped out by something like a Mirror Wall. I personally remember Mega Cyber shining when Balance started to see more heavy play, and we'll probably discuss Balance further in the next entry. But for now, just know that he was sort of a comeback mechanic, but would end up being more impactful in later decks. I love seeing cards that I remember from my childhood getting the spotlight in Duel Links, and the release of Soul Exchange is one of the few times that I can recall a nostalgia bait card finding a foothold of power in Duel Links. While it wasn't exactly viable in the TCG, Soul Exchange quickly became a powerful removal card and helped tribute summoning gain some momentum. In an era where removal was still few and far between, it's not really shocking that it became so sought after. And although many players still didn't have access to it, Soul Exchange combined with Enemy Controller was absolutely devastating. If you've been playing Duel Links recently, you've probably seen Divine Wrath come up in several places, specifically in Blue Eyes decks. It was reprinted in Selection Box 1, but its first appearance was all the way back in this very box. It was a fairly powerful card back then that only got better with time, as the game leaned more heavily on an increased prevalence of effect monsters with stronger and stronger effects. Negates weren't exactly common back then, but having an out to some of your opponent's nastier effects was, and still is, obviously a good thing. It may not have made a huge splash upon release, but it shocked me just how long ago this card released and how you're apt to see it in competitive play in 2021. One of my most painful memories of early ranked play was facing off against decks that included Pump Princess, the Princess of Ghosts. A somewhat new take on the classic Pump King, the King of Ghosts, this card sucked up your monster's stats while laughing from the back row. Nowadays, this card would die 15 ways to Sunday, but back in the old days of very little back row hate, Pump Princess was one of the first cards to make me groan and roll my eyes. But in all seriousness, Pumpkin Stall was a solid deck, and it wasn't that shocking to see it pop up in Ladder. But to this very day, Pump Princess still has me waking up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. I discussed the Parasite Infestation deck during the last episode of History of Duel Links, a stall deck which aimed to use cards like Cocoon of Evolution and Parasite Parasite to suck up your opponent's life points. And that deck actually received further support in Burning Land. Not only was this used to wipe out the still viable field power bonus spells, but as Parasite Infestation was a stall deck, it could be used to speed up your opponent's death. These two things together made it that much harder to deal with the Infestation deck, and led to it holding its ground as the meta went through a drastic shift around this time. I think it would be incredibly fair to say that duelists were desperate for back row removal during this time period. We were a long way off from the days of Cosmic Cyclone, MST, Night Beam, and the dozens of other back row destruction cards, so even things like Wild Tornado were a godsend. It was slow, allowed your opponent to simply replace the card you destroyed if they had something in their hand, but as I've often said in this series, we didn't have much else. Plus, if your opponent did happen to destroy it, it left a parting gift in the destruction of one of their face-ups. And hey, if you couldn't remove your opponent's back row from the field, why not lock them down entirely? Cards like Jingjin Hu did see some play, as it was yet another way to try and stop back row from being used. This card was a bit stronger in Duel Links because of the limited amount of spell and trap spaces, but it was somewhat of a double-edged sword. You'd be sacrificing one of your own spell and trap spaces to use it. And again, it was slow. The instant gratification of back row hate through a quick play spell was a long way off, so we had to settle somehow. Those of you looking to capitalize on any shallow graves you may have pulled from the last box might have turned to something like Hero's Shadow Scout for an early mill strategy. My memory's a bit foggy, but I remember there was some buzz about this card, and Mill in general, since the game only featured 20 cards in a single deck. This guy was only a rare, and there were a few ways you could cycle through them, but I don't think this strategy made as much of a splash as I recall being concerned about, even with just 20 cards to a deck. There's one last card I want to mention before I wrap this thing up, and that's Skull Lair. Why? Well, because of a little card called Relinquished. We'll talk more about Relinquished's impact on the game in the next segment, but it was seeing a ton of play. And since some of the best cards to defend against him, like Econ, were hard to come by, this served as a great stand-in for Relinquished Destruction. All you needed to do was banish a card from your grave to kill him, and this forced Relinquished players to start using the limited back row destruction to stop this thing from shutting them down. With all that in mind, I don't think it's too hard to see why Flame of the Tyrant was seen as such a weaker box at first glance. It had some useful things here and there, but Valkyrie's Rage had some great tech options, cards that built upon popular themes and central strategies, and a downright solid spread across almost every rarity. I'd certainly feel a bit ripped off if I invested in Flame of the Tyrant, only to have Valkyrie's Rage come in and prove itself to be a far more worthy investment, at least as far as first impressions were concerned. While I don't think this main box was as game-changing as, say, Neo Impact, I feel that it was still an improvement over other boxes available at the time. I think for that time, this box would probably reach somewhere around a B-. While the cards and strategies in this box weren't the stars of the decks from Duel Links' first major PvP event, many of them served as ways to try and shut down the most popular strategies being used. I suppose you might even be able to argue that it was a last-minute effort to provide outs to things like Relinquished. Unfortunately, this is yet another box that's essentially lost to time in terms of modern importance. Clearly the cards in it were impactful enough to call for reprints, as cards like Soul Exchange, Divine Wrath, Wild Tornado, Jingjin Hu, and even Skull Lair were all released in the game's first selection box. But as for Valkyrie's Rage itself, the cards that are left behind are far from worth your gems or cash, so stay away. This one's definitely a D. With 2 boxes released so quickly, and competitive interest in the game rising every day, the meta was in for a massive shift. So many cards released so quickly would end up leading to one of the most diverse metagames in the history of Duel Links, and perhaps in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Itself. As previously mentioned, whereas the first snapshot of the meta revolved around beefy monsters hitting opponents in the face, everything would change from here on out. Not everything from the beatdown meta would become obsolete, but it was obvious how big of a shift there was. In fact, many of the cards that were considered staples have already been covered, either in past episodes or in this very entry. So let's take a quick look at some key cards before we try to unpack this massive field of competitive decks. Jerry Beans Man would go on to become the hero of the first ever KC Cup, as he was just too good to pass up for decks like Dinos and Harpies that were constantly in danger of losing their field spells. He was strong, avoided the wrath of 4-starred Ladybug, and even resisted some other decks like Power of Dark. Near the end of the KC Cup, he would begin to fall to the aforementioned Possessed Dark Soul, but he remained mostly unchallenged in this second snapshot. Enemy Controller had unsurprisingly become a staple across all of Duel Links, and even went on to basically become representative of the game itself, while Mirror Wall almost single-handedly helped develop the game into a slower-paced affair. They were both versatile, powerful, and in many cases, game-winning cards. Mirror Wall fell off, at least as far as a win condition was concerned, but still stayed as evidence of the most skilled player's ability to play with and around it. Econ was far too all-around to pass up, and to this day still sees a decent amount of play. Some other important cards reviewed in this episode included Sergeant Electro, who had a Cinderella story of being a random card from the manga, to Drunk in the TCG, to the anti-meta god of Duel Links. Possessed Dark Soul was like 4-starred Ladybug on steroids, and could even yoink some cards from the most popular decks like Relinquished, Venus, Clown Control, and even Jerry Beans Man himself. And of course, Soul Exchange, a pseudo-removal card that could set you up for tribute summons. These were all reviewed in the last couple segments, so I won't retread too much ground here. Thunder Dragon was a card that was used in one of the first instances of a skill becoming problematic, Switcheroo. While it would later be swapped out for Restart following a nerf, Switcheroo was wild back in the day. Who needs Pot of Greed when you can use one Thunder Dragon to get 2 of himself, send back to the deck to draw something new, then used again to fetch the one you just sent back. Yeah, it was way too strong, so it was no shock that it was not only seen everywhere in Ladder and KC Cup, but was also nerfed not long after. The last card I'll quickly touch on before diving into some decks is Interdimensional Matter Transporter. This is another pretty weird one, but also a card that suddenly saw a spike in use near the end of KC Cup. Once Duelists learned that it could effectively be used to reset Relinquished, the race was on. It also helped people dodge some of the other dangerous cards like Soul Exchange, Order to Charge, and so on. While completely unreliable these days, it was kind of a godsend back then. So, it's finally time to talk about decks, and there are a ton of them. There were so many arguably viable competitive decks back then that I feel like I can't cover every single one, lest this turn into a feature-length documentary rather than a mini-documentary series. So, I've chosen 8 decks that were heavily played in Ranked, as well as the February-March 2017 KC Cup to showcase for this video. I would argue that these are the 8 decks that truly defined the game during this period, and should give you more than enough of an idea of what the competitive scene looked like. Just keep in mind that there were plenty of other things to choose from. I should mention that 2 decks from the Beatdown era actually survived this first meta shift, those being Dino and Parasite Infestation. Dino would start using Sergeant Electro to keep themselves relevant, but aside from that, nothing notable changed about them. I'll touch on Parasite Infestation later, as their playstyle went through some changes during that time, but for now, let's check out some of the new decks. I'd like to begin this meta showcase with the big man himself, Relinquished. One of the biggest issues players found in the earliest days of Duel Links was a lack of monster removal. But what if you were given a way to reliably remove monsters from your opponent's field, and you could use those monsters' stats against your opponent, and it could protect itself, requiring it to be attacked twice, and it was free? It sounds ridiculous, but it was 100% true. If you wanted a viable ritual deck in Yu-Gi-Oh!, this was the time to be playing. There were a number of factors that made Relinquished a stupidly powerful and successful deck, so I'll hit them in succession. First was, of course, Relinquished himself. Monster stealing, protection, and you could get him from Pegasus as opposed to booster packs. It featured 2 different tutor cards, with both Senju of the Thousand Hands and Sonic Bird being played, usually at 3 copies. It ran Sphere Kuribo and Enemy Controller, making it even harder to actually swing at Relinquished to try and get rid of his meat shield. And lastly, these decks opted for the Thunder Dragon Switcheroo package, making it all too easy to get exactly what they needed, when they needed it. Another deck that rose to power for a similar reason was the early version of the Harpy deck. While it looks nothing like the post-Sign of Harpies release build, this deck got popular because of how easy it was to destroy spells and traps. So, much like Relinquished, its viability was somewhat based upon exploiting a mechanic that wasn't exactly widespread, through the use of the Harpies' Hunting Ground skill to attack the back row. They were incredibly good at stopping things like Mirror Wall, and could completely demolish Dinos and other field spell reliant decks like Daedalus. Harpies' Hunting Ground made every single Harpy lady in your deck an MST, and made perfect fodder for something like Order to Charge. Once you had summoned one, it had already done its job, and could be used to blow up 1 card in the opponent's front row, and 1 in the back. You could even tech in Elegant Egotist to summon Harpy Lady Sisters in a time where those kinds of special summons weren't exactly prevalent. The deck's downfall was that it was missing good winged beast monsters, so it didn't pack as much of a punch as it could have. But don't worry, this will be far from the last time we see Harpies as a staple of the metagame. Sticking to the theme of early archetypes, Gravekeepers were also a go-to choice for players looking to make an impact in the competitive scene. It was essentially the free-to-play deck, as you could pretty much get everything you needed for it from drops against legendary duelists and the card trader. It wasn't exactly easy to grind out in those days, but the duelists that buckled down and put it together found an incredibly strong deck with a veritable Swiss Army knife of incredible cards. Gravekeeper's Oracle was truly the beast of the deck, sapping your opponent's monster's attack at the cost of a single tribute. He could also wipe out face-down monsters, making it nearly impossible to escape him. Gravekeeper's Recruiter allowed you to search your deck, and with Gravekeeper's Chief providing an engine to repeatedly play him, you could search like no other deck at the time. Finally, there was Gravekeeper's Priestess, a defensive monster which could get beefed up to 1900 defense under a skill like Power of Dark. It forced your opponent to sit and watch as you became practically unstoppable. It was a terrifying deck that was completely free, and very unsurprising at just how popular it was back then. Moving on, the next deck on our list is a deck I affectionately refer to as Clown Control. though I'd argue you could just as easily call this deck 20 card good stuff. It was, quite literally, a mixture of a bunch of good cards, and its power level was comparable to the theme decks that ruled the rank ladder and competitive scene at the time. The deck was entirely able to survive thanks to the existence of Mirror Wall, as its monsters weren't particularly strong and needed a little help in the back row. Combined with cards like Desert Sunlight and Curse of Anubis to change battle positions, this deck made Dream Clown a serious threat when it hit the board, as it was incredibly easy to destroy your opponent's monsters. It leaned on other cards like Sergeant Electro to ensure that it could lock opponents down, and combined with other anti-meta tech cards, it became a nightmare for competitive players. Of course, it used Switcheroo to get rid of the tools it didn't need at the time to replace them with more powerful cards. Clown control would survive for a long time, and it seemed to only gain even more and more cards, but no matter how large the pool became, the central strategy remained the same. There was another very similar deck that topped the KC Cup in the North-South America region, Anti-Meta Guardian Statue. It opted to use Destiny Draw instead of Switcheroo, and in some ways may have been even nastier than the Clown Control version. Mirror Wall was a necessity for this deck as well, but rather than destroy your opponent's monsters, it opted to steal them. Guardian Statue could flip itself face down and send one of your opponent's monsters back to their hand, while cards like Amazonish Chainmaster were used to hand-rip those very same monsters away. It even opted to use Possessed Dark Soul to steal any monsters your opponent may have been able to hold on to. Like its Clown counterpart, it also relied on popular tech choices of the time, such as Mirror Wall, Econ, Twister, Interdimensional Matter Transporter, and Windstorm of Edequa. Alright, we've spent a large part of this video building up to this deck, so let's talk about Venus Shineball, the deck utilizing cards like Agent of Creation Venus and Sky Scourge Inrise. It was a somewhat beat-down reliant deck, revolving around dumping Venus onto the board, spamming Mystical Shineball, and using them to summon monsters like Inrise, or pay costs for popular staples and other cards. Venus was central to the deck, as were the Shineballs themselves, but the basic idea was to get Shineball into play to easily use cards like White Elephant's Gift for that lovely draw effect, or Order to Charge to clear your opponent's board and let your monsters swing in directly. You could even tech in Order to Smash for some back row destruction. The goal was to try and put several Shineballs into grave, then use something like a Sphere Karibo to fulfill all the requirements to dump Inrise, then swing for game. It was an off-putting yet viable deck that would only receive further support in future expansions. A nasty little deck that reared its head around this time was Standby Burn, a deck that utilized Taya Gardner's skill known as Dual Standby. This would let players start with one additional card in their hand, and basically enabled some incredibly fast burn plays. While it wasn't one of the most competitive decks in the higher ranks and KC Cup, it was still gruesome to face. Its biggest problem was consistency, as it didn't utilize any fancy engines and possessed no real way to get its burn pieces together faster. The highest damage dealing card in the deck without a doubt was Restructor Revolution, which dealt 200 damage to your opponent for each card in their hand. Combined with things like Cup of Ace that actually have a chance to give them even more cards, Standby Burn's turn 1 was usually disgusting. On top of those two, you'd use cards like Goblin Thief and Gravekeepers Curse to deal extra damage, Card of Sanctity to draw more gas, and Magical Merchant to dig for those precious Restructors. Again, this all led to a very flimsy strategy that could fall apart on bad draws, but was incredibly powerful when the cards aligned. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the new and improved Parasite Infestation before we head into the final segment of this episode. As previously mentioned, this Weevil deck underwent a bit of a facelift. This new version would lean more heavily into burn territory thanks to updates from Valkyrie's Rage. Of the two burn decks in the game, it was certainly the more successful, at least in terms of results, and was far more deadly in my opinion. The deck would continue to utilize its classic tricks in cards like Gyakugire, 4-starred Ladybug, Mask of the Accursed, and of course Parasite, but they proved that old dogs can certainly learn new tricks. They began using Jade Insect Whistle to search out Parasite and stack their opponent's decks against them. Pum Princess was added to not only drain their opponent's monsters of their attack, but also to start a mind game, to bait out mistakes that could cost them games while hurrying against the Pumpkin's clock. And they even began to use Iron Blacksmith Kotetsu, a rare from Flame of the Tyrant, to search for their Masks of the Accursed. Improved consistency and lethality led to this being one of the top decks in this format. And with that, we've essentially completed a wide-reaching snapshot of what you might have seen at the time. It was an incredibly diverse point in the meta of Duel Links, and ultimately made for a fresh, enjoyable experience. There was a little something for everyone, no matter your playstyle, and this led to heightened interest in the game's competitive scene. While Duel Links has always featured a ranked ladder similar to other competitive online games, it wouldn't be long before players completed their journey to the top, to the King of Games title. From that point, it didn't seem like there was much left. No more mountains to climb. They had reached the peak. Right? Near the end of February, an announcement was made in-game about the first ever upcoming tournament known as the KC Cup. Though the announcement was a bit of a surprise, it was far from unexpected for Konami to want to promote and encourage competitive play. There was already a deep interest in how competitive Duel Links would look, and there were a great number of COG-level duelists who were ready to really put their skills to the test. The end of February and beginning of March marked the first ever KC Cup, and would pave the way for the event to be run multiple times throughout the year, even to the current day in 2021. However, its importance and payout has changed over time, and a major event like this doesn't come to fruition without some bumps in the road. So, to round out this final stop in the Tyrant Valkyrie format, let's take a look at the very first KC Cup and the controversies surrounding the event. The tournament was set to take place between February 27th and March 6th, and was available to anyone that had reached Mission Stage 20. The KC Cup would replace ranked duels during the duration of the event, and started off by requiring players to choose the region which they'd like to compete in, with this choice being irreversible after being made. There was a claim that players who disconnect would be more harshly penalized than usual, so that was sort of a deterrent from players competing outside their region. However, this was what led to the first major controversy. Players from Japan who had an advantage over global client duelists playing outside of their region. While everyone had access to the same cards, Japanese duelists essentially had a head start in terms of practice. They were more used to the client and had much more time to develop their decks and strategies, which led to the appearance of Japanese names in several different regions' leaderboards and frustration among the player base. The other controversy here had to do with the main box that dropped on the very first day of competition. Valkyrie's Rage. Yes, you heard me correctly. Konami made the decision to include a new pool of cards in the game right at the start of the competition. Not only did this create an issue with gym economy for many players, forcing some to skip the box entirely, this also led to a mad dash for strategies that could take competitors by surprise and push duelists to the top of the leaderboard. It was a mess, and it gave us some last-minute discoveries and techs that would start popping up days into the tournament, with some even appearing on the very last day, as previously mentioned. So how exactly did this event work? Well, you would be match-made against other duelists in your region and would compete to earn duel points. Winning earns you DP, and losing takes it away. Once you earned enough points, you'd level up and slowly begin to work your way up through the rankings in the event. All participants would be given a set of sleeves and a playmat, something we still see to this very day with little change. The top duelists in each region would gain access to a variety of loot, including UR and SR cards, an icon definitively proving their prowess in the event, and gold. Modern day players may be surprised to hear that there are no invites being handed out during this first tournament. Though players took it seriously, as it was the first shot at truly competitive play in the game's life, the KC Cup was not a means to an end. While the list of obtainable prize cards looks abysmal by today's standards, there were some heavy hitters in this list, particularly things like Enemy Controller, Thunder Dragon, Riryoku, Union Attack, and so on. There were also a few cards that you couldn't normally obtain in prismatic form outside of the KC Cup prizes, so some players opted for those for the purpose of higher scores during farming. Ultimately though, when you look at the decks that were competing for these top prizes, even the allure of powerful cards wasn't all that enticing, as many KC Cup decks were using those very same cards to reach the top. Some of the decks that ended up ruling the KC Cup were the ones discussed in the previous meta snapshot. Things like Relinquished, Clown Control, Standby Burn, Dino, Gravekeeper, and so on. If I had to choose one overall that was the dominant force in the tournament, it'd be Relinquished, hands down. The One-Eyed Wonder managed to top both the Japan and North American KC Cup rankings, despite players digging for any and all answers they could until the very end. Some well-known names would make their debut in the highest positions of the first ever KC Cup leaderboard. Names like King Halo, wielding the mighty Relinquished, Jason Chu with the new and improved Parasite Infestation, and even some guy named Decayed, a duelist rocking Gravekeepers in second place on the NA leaderboard. This Decayed guy would go on to compile many of these deck lists in a website called Duel Links Meta, a household name within the Duel Links community. Somewhat unbelievably, the page with his collection of KC Cup deck lists is actually still available, and I've included a link in the description if you'd like to check it out for yourself. While Decayed, Duel Links Meta, and the community that spawned from its inception is a story in of itself, it's a story for another day. Otherwise, this video may never end. Not that I'd mind that, but this is a journey we need to take one step at a time. A marathon, not a sprint. Next time on the history of Duel Links, with the gauntlet thrown during the first competition, players are now fully aware of how Duel Links works on a competitive level. A war of attrition demanding resilience, resource management, and careful planning. The introduction of KC Cup prizes into the card pool meant that there were even better tuned competitive decks running around, and some would even argue that these were more impactful than cards included in the next 3 boxes we'll be covering: Wonders of the Sky, Chaotic Compliance, and Land of the Titans. Each had subtle effects on the meta, but many of the cards would ultimately be useless to competitive duelists and the community at large. We'll check out the next format, with several decks from the KC Cup getting some new tools and combos. Decks like Harpies and Gravekeepers would both get new support and find new ways to utilize old cards, while skills like Last Gamble and the infamous 3-star demotion would lead to a slew of new, powerful, and sometimes gimmicky builds. And finally, with the KC Cup out of the way, Konami would unveil a brand new event. One that would pit the best of the best against one another in a race to the pinnacle of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, the World Championships. Hype was mounting surrounding the announcement of a Duel Links branch of the WCS, and we'll be covering another controversy surrounding the qualifying events. But for now, it's time to wrap things up. This is by far the longest episode of the history of Duel Links, and I appreciate you making it all the way to the end. Before you go, please let me thank a couple people who helped with the information necessary to write this script. As I introduced in the last episode, Reddit user YinTemp has some excellent write-ups about various formats and time periods throughout Duel Links that have served as the launchpad for almost every single one of my scripts so far. The link to the post I used for this video is in the description. I also have to give a big thanks to Kiryu Ryo, who also helped contribute some of the info in this video. I've left a link to their YouTube channel in the description, so stop by and check out some of their Duel Links and TCG content. And of course, none of this would be possible without you. This series has gotten some great reception so far, and I hope that word about it continues to spread so that the community at large can enjoy this project that I've been working on. But you all are the ones who write the history I cover, so thank you for everything. The Duel Links and wider Yu-Gi-Oh! Communities have been nothing but excellent, so this is my thanks for that kindness. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next entry in the history of Duel Links. Roll outro.